Without a doubt, The Evil Dead is one of the most significant and influential horror films ever made. It all started in the early 1970s in the brain of young aspiring filmmaker Sam Raimi. Sam, his brother Ted, and his friends Bruce Campbell, Josh Becker, and Scott Spiegel made quick, cheap Super 8 films in high school. After high school, Sam went to Michigan State University, where he met Rob Tapert. Tapert also had a love of movies and joined them in making Super 8 films. While in college, Raimi was studying ancient history. In the class, they went over the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which he thought would make a great title for a horror film. They soon discovered they could rent out the college auditorium and charge admission for their films. They made one called Happy Valley Kid that cost $750 and made over $10,000. Seeing the potential in this, they dropped out of college to focus on filmmaking. Tapper did research and discovered many directors started out in horror. Not only was it the cheapest to produce, but also the easiest to get distribution for. They filmed a 30-minute short called Within the Woods, which was the basic foundation for what would eventually become The Evil Dead. Although in Within the Woods, the roles were reversed and Bruce Campbell was possessed by a demon. They shopped the short around, trying to drum up enough interest for investors to fund a full production. They continue to play Within the Woods at colleges and film festivals. One critic said the short was scarier than The Prophecy and the Amityville Horror combined, which helped to give them some much-needed attention. After months of work, they finally had their investors. They had their initial startup capital, which was roughly $90,000 of the $350,000 they'd need. During this time, they worked on getting the cast, crew, and location. Since the weather in Detroit was often cold, they were looking to shoot further south. They found a location in Tennessee that was perfect. When it came time for casting, they already had Bruce Campbell and Ellen Sandweiss on board, since they were both in Within the Woods. It was a small cast, so they only needed 2 more women and 1 man. Eventually, they hired Betsy Baker as Linda, Teresa Tilley as Shelley, and Richard DeManicore, using the stage name Hal Delrich, as Scott. The legal work and getting their money into a business account took longer than expected and delayed the shoot. Because of the delay, they lost their location and had to look for another. They finally had everything straightened out, but it was now November. They didn't have a location, but they needed to start filming. While looking for a new cabin, they shot stuff with the car and some establishing shots. They landed a new location in Morristown, Tennessee. There was a problem with the new cabin, though. It had been abandoned for years, and the floor was covered in layers of cow shit. They cleaned out the cabin and proceeded to modify it to fit their needs. Since the cabin had no electricity or running water, they had to bring in generators for power, and designated a part of the woods as the bathroom. They ripped out the roof so they could fit their lighting rigs, built a porch, cut out holes for windows, and knocked down walls. With the cabin ready, they could start shooting the rest of the film. The whole reason they filmed in Tennessee was because of how notoriously cold Michigan was, and by comparison, Tennessee was supposed to have mild winters. That year, Tennessee had one of the coldest winters on record, and Michigan was unseasonably warm. It was now late November in Tennessee, and it was freezing. They didn't put glass in the windows, so they wouldn't have to worry about glare. The only time the windows had glass was when they were about to be broken. Sometimes they were filming night scenes during the day, so they hung thick black blankets over the windows. The cabin didn't have a basement, so they cut a hole in the floor, dug a 6-foot trench, and added a staircase. The basement scenes were shot in the basement of Rob Tapert's parents' house months later. The shed with the bones in it was an homage to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The 2 guys they drive past in the beginning are Sam Raimi and Rob Tapert.
I'll go to hell. I'm not honking at you.
The cast and crew all pulled double and triple duty. Since there was no stuntmen, the actors had to do their own stunts, which was fairly painful.
Okay, and action.
The beams that fell off the bridge were styrofoam. They used the same ones later when Ash was fighting Linda. Tapper was the one who came up with the idea of the tree rape. He said he wanted it to be so bad, it would hurt the audience. To get the look of the moving roots, they filmed the scenes and then played them in reverse. The Tamaqua shirt was a reference to Camp Tamaqua, where Sam went to summer camp. The camp was the basis for Indian Summer, a movie he'd have a small part in the future. When Ash puts his hand through the mirror, they did it by having him lay on his stomach over a kiddie pool, covered by the mirror frame. They called the spirits moving through the forest the Evil Force, or just the Force for short. To get these famous shots, they mounted the camera on a 2x4, and Raimi held it and ran through the forest. The fake blood they used was the old classic of Cairo and dye. It was so cold in the cabin, the blood-soaked clothes stuck to the actors and froze. The guts were Cairo and Alpo dog food. The scene where the entire cabin leaks blood was an homage to the Three Stooges episode, A Plumbing We Will Go. To give a sense of unease, they shot most of the second half of the film with tilted angles. This scene was lit by two lights positioned to make it look like headlights. In the beginning of the movie, the car dodges a truck. Originally, they wanted to swerve out of the way of logs falling off a logging truck. They decided this would be too dangerous and expensive to film. The car is a 1973 Oldsmobile Delta 88, affectionately called the Classic. Raimi managed to sneak the car into every movie he directed. It was even in the remake of Evil Dead, as well as Ash vs. the Evil Dead. Tom Sullivan did the makeup effects, as well as built many of the props. Originally, Linda was supposed to get stabbed in the leg. They thought it'd be 10 times more painful if she got stabbed in the Achilles tendon. And they were right. The leg was a fake rubber one. The Foley sound for the pencil going into the foot was a knife going into an apple. For the spiderweb animation, Sullivan drew the art on the ankle as single-frame animation. It took an hour and a half for only a few seconds of screen time. The contacts they had were so thick, it made it impossible for the actors to see. When they bought them, they were told only to keep them in for 15 minutes at a time, a few times a day. They ignored this and kept them in way longer than they should have. The actors said it was like pouring hot sauce in your eyes. The shoot was extremely rough. They shot for 16-hour days, and many times the cast and crew fell asleep from exhaustion. One time while looking at the dailies, they noticed an entire reel was one static shot because Sam fell asleep and left the camera rolling. There was only one person in the crew that worked on a full production before, so they made lots of mistakes because they didn't know any better. The windows they smashed were real glass, not candy glass. The gun was firing actual bullets. Campbell held a real chainsaw over Betsy and swore he wouldn't drop it. Everyone got hurt one way or another.
Ow! God damn.
Ted Raimi's hands came through the floor, and the splinters cut Bruce Campbell's face. Ellen's legs were cut up repeatedly while she ran through the woods. The actors had a thing called the latex point. This is the point in the shoot where they had been in makeup or an uncomfortable position for so long, they lost their shit and wanted out. This happened a lot. At the end of a day's shooting, they had a local home where everyone would rest and clean off. One day they returned to find someone had ransacked the cabin and stole all of their tools. Ironically, they took the easily replaceable equipment, but didn't touch the very expensive cameras and film gear. 6 weeks had passed and it was almost Christmas, so the cast and crew went home, even though filming was far from over. Most everyone returned on January 1st and worked until the 5th. After that, they left because they had other projects, and they already worked well beyond what they signed up for. They didn't stop filming, though. They kept going. Although now there was only 5 people left working. Sam Raimi, Rob Tappert, Bruce Campbell, Josh Becker, and David Goodman. Without any of the actresses, they had to use what they called fake shemps. They dressed whoever they could up in demon makeup and battered them around so they could get the shots they needed. The lease expired in the house they were staying in, and since they had nowhere else to go, they moved into the cabin. The road they drove in on in the beginning was the road that went to the actual location. After months of filming and driving on it every day, it was nothing but mud. The original intent was to film for 6 weeks. It was now over 12. They finally stopped filming at the cabin and returned home. They continued to film the basement scenes, in both Tappert's parents' basement and Raimi's garage. For the Deadites Melding, Bart Pierce filmed it as stop-motion animation in his basement over the course of 3 months. As they assembled the film, they noticed certain scenes were missing. They occasionally returned to the cabin to get the shots they needed. For the final shot, it was rumored that Sam Raimi mounted the camera on a motorcycle and drove it through the house. Campbell swears it was a lie, and the final shot was Sam running through the woods and into him with the camera. The intro was the last thing they filmed. Sam sat in an inflatable raft with the camera, while Campbell pushed him. They returned to the cabin, but squatters had moved in. At some point, the squatters burned down the cabin, and the only thing that remains is the fireplace. Future Oscar-winning director Joel Cohen of the Coen brothers was the first assistant editor. This was one of his first jobs in the industry. From 1979 to 1983, they worked on the film. They had a screening for their investors, as well as potential distributors. One of the investors was angry. He told them, "I thought you boys were making a horror picture, not a comedy." The agent suggested they change the name to The Evil Dead, because Book of the Dead would make the audience think they had to read. They made a deal with New Line to distribute in the US. When it premiered, the audience laughed and yelled at the screen. This confused the executives at New Line, thinking that the audience hated the movie. After one showing, they started insisting that the film was going to have to be majorly edited. Thankfully, they were convinced to sit through another showing. The theater was sold out, and this time they realized the audience wasn't yelling, they were cheering. After that, there was no further mention of edits. Film critic Leonard Maltin saw the film, and said it was the most disgusting thing he'd ever seen, which ended up making more people want to see it. Stephen King saw it and said it was the most ferociously original horror film of the year. This was huge for the film, and they used the quote on their marketing. They made a deal for the international distribution with Palace Pictures, who bought the rights for $60,000. In a bold move, they released the film simultaneously in theaters and on home video in the UK. It was a smash hit. It ended up being the most rented film of the year and sold over 50,000 copies. Things were going very well. That is, until the National Viewers and Listeners Association stepped in. The NVALA is made up of members of the press, social commentators, and various religious groups. They created something called the Video Nasties List, a list of film the group deemed obscene. Because of this, here was a landmark revolutionary film being confiscated from sellers like it was contraband. Raimi, Tappert, and the distributors were brought up on obscenity charges, and if they lost in court, they'd go to prison. Thankfully, the distributor managed to get the judge to watch the film, and afterwards he threw the case out. Back in the US, the movie did well in theaters, but it made a huge impact on home video. The video market was just taking off, and The Evil Dead was an incredibly popular rental. It was also the most stolen VHS in America at the time. Years went by, and even though Sam Raimi was becoming a very well-known director, the ladies of The Evil Dead were embarrassed by the film and didn't put it on their resumes. They found out about a Halloween screening, and they were shocked to see a huge crowd. They contacted other members of the cast and crew, and in 2002, had a reunion showing in Royal Oak, Michigan. Which brings us to now. It's been over 30 years since the film was released, and it's even more popular now than it was back then. The movie had 2 sequels, a remake, comics, spin-offs, video games, and now a very popular cable TV series. There's even an Evil Dead musical. Sam Raimi has become one of the most successful, sought-after directors in Hollywood, and Bruce Campbell's moved from an actor to a legend. They may not have known exactly what they were doing, but they had talent, creativity, and perseverance. They continued working despite horrible conditions and no money. They forged on past the point of where others would have quit. These guys would not stop until they had the movie that they wanted. The Evil Dead became a horror staple and influenced a new generation of directors, as well as other movies. Not too bad for some college dropouts from Detroit.
Well, I just did a film called The Woods. Agnes Bruckner's the lead in it, and she's a 18-year-old, and it was just very funny to show up on the set. She's going, oh, this fake blood. Oh, and she's got like a patch here and a patch here. I'm like, honey pie, wait till you sat under a 55-gallon drum and had it empty on your face, and then you and I can talk.